Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lust, Drugs, and Rock and Roll with Miss Evelyn. I am very lucky to be joined with Niki Davis-Fainbloom. She is a Canadian-born, New York-based sex educator, researcher, and coach. Her work uses up-to-date research, humor, and practical advice to assist people in developing the skills needed for healthier and more satisfying relationships. Since earning her master's degree from NYU, she has facilitated more than 500 sexual education workshops at locations including Planned Parenthood, NYU, and the United Nations. Her writing has also been featured in Mind, Body, Green, Cosmopolitan, and The Insider. She's in the process of writing a book aimed at demystifying fetishes. You can find her on Instagram at Miss Bloom Sex Educator. Thank you so much for joining. How are you?
Thank you. What a lovely introduction.
I know, right? It's as if I didn't even write it.
It's as if you actually pronounced my name correctly, which never happens.
What do you
The
normally
Fain
get?
bloom always gets people.
Fame? What do they normally say?
Fain bloom, oh, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. It's just, is it usually Fain bloom?
Experience. Kink and fetish isn't particularly new. I mean, you just need to read a Marquis de Sade book, and like it's been around for a while. So, what would you say demystifying fetishes mean?
I think it's sort of working to a space where people can accept whatever it is that they desire, because I think a lot of folks that I work with, there's so much shame around whatever it is that they happen to be turned on by, and basically normalizing the abnormal,
Mm-hmm.
realizing that it's really common to be turned on by something unique.
Mm-hmm.
Like almost 50% of people have some type of arousal that could be considered abnormal. So that kind of makes it normal. What is unique is that people can be turned on by a bunch of different types of objects, experiences, activities. So, sort of my work and my research is a lot on how do we get to a space where people who have less common desires can express them and not feel shame, can get to a place where they can tell partners about them, can get to a place where they don't have to hold on to it for 30 years until it kind of comes out. Because a lot of my work, it's like in my conversations with people, it's their first time ever telling someone what they're into.
Yeah.
And it just sucks that we live in a world where so many people have to experience shame about something that's just can be like a fun addition to their sex life.
Yeah. And I think, given something like 50 Shades of Grey, again, whatever opinions you have about the literature or just how it was written or the plot point, I think there is something to be said about how big that was. And if you've gone into any sex shop post 50 Shades, their BDSM section is empty. So I think what you were saying
Yeah.
really speaks to that a lot of people, I think you said 50% of people like have something that is abnormal, which makes me want to ask, a lot of the terminology, especially in the clinical world, is living an alternative lifestyle. And I'm wondering what you think about that phrasing of it.
I think that in time, it's just going to be called a lifestyle. Um,
Can only hope.
but I think basically a lot of different types of sexuality is sort of a lot more common than people think, especially after we sort of get rid of the shame around it.
Mm-hmm.
I think people are naturally kind of inclined and open to a lot of types of different experiences. So I don't have a strong feeling about the word, except that I don't know how alternative it is necessarily if we were in a place where we can all openly express what we're interested in.
Yeah. And for those who maybe where this isn't basic information for them, how would you differentiate kink versus fetish?
Yeah. So a kink is sort of more of an umbrella term that includes any types of desires that, again, are deemed as less common, which gets complicated, right? Because as we said, BDSM right now is so
Yeah.
common, but I think it would still be considered a kink.
Yeah.
Whereas fetishes are very specific. So
Mhm.
fetishes are, they usually develop at a younger age, and usually folks are very specifically aroused or interested by an object, by an experience, by an activity. That doesn't mean it's unhealthy. It just means that it's sort of like a focus. And I think one of the myths around fetishes is that that's the only type of desire that person can ever be turned on by. But for a lot of people, it's not that. It's like a fun addition that they can add to their sex lives.
Um, Great. Something else I wanted to add is, in your bio, given that you're Canadian born, but then did a lot of your education and now, professional life in New York, I'm wondering, do you notice any cultural differences between, whether it's at a political level, cultural level, microsystem level with regards to attitudes towards sexual exploration in Canada versus the United States? And I guess I should be specific, given that you're from Toronto, and now being in New York City, that in itself can be different, but do you notice any differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I would say overall, Toronto is just a little better in some ways, as in we just get a little more basic education. Like in Toronto, I never met anyone that was against abortion. There's sort of like a basic level of understanding. But what I find fascinating is for a long time, I did consent workshops in New York schools. And what is so different in New York specifically is just the range of knowledge. So even like the difference between going to a school in Queens where I have to go through the detector before I come in, and there it's like no one knows what pronouns are, no one sort of has a way to talk about sexuality at all. And then I go to like a private school that might be just like a mile or two away, where everyone is just very queer, very open, very able to express what they want. They come in there and they're teaching me about consent. So it's like, that's what I find interesting, is that there's just like such differences within New York City. Whereas I find in Canada, maybe just because of the curriculum or whatever it is, there's a little bit more of like a standard knowledge that a lot of people have, and maybe less disparity, is that a word? Discrepancy between
English, yay.
English, less of a discrepancy sort of in students' knowledge around sex.
Yeah. You're just
like I was doing a middle school workshop, and this student came up to me after, and he was like, is it true that my hands are going to grow hair because I masturbate? And it's like, that's what his family taught him. And that's the way he felt about self-pleasure, like genuinely. And it just broke my heart, like how that is still in parts of New York, people don't have basic understanding that like masturbation doesn't make you grow hair on your palms or isn't bad for you in some other way. So I think that probably wouldn't happen in Canada. That's my guess.
Yeah. And again, we can't say it never does, but yeah, I would agree that maybe that wouldn't be as common in Canada. Speaking of that kind of shame, like a very Puritan culture, I'm wondering, when you have clients present themselves, whether it's wanting to explore pleasure, just exploring sex, even just finding out words that we would consider very basic, finding that in sessions with you, what would you say is probably the best key of advice that you can give to somebody who's starting to explore or trying to work with any internalized shame?
That's such a good question. And it's so hard. It's so hard. I think the first part is like, you need to kind of get to the place of like a little bit of knowledge, which is hard. It's like you kind of need to be exposed to the right resources that can help rework your brain from whatever you've been taught before. And you need to realize that it's like we're all growing as people, and sexuality is something that changes throughout your lifetime, and it's something that continues to evolve. But kind of the first step is to figure out what it is you like, because before you know that, you can't tell anyone you can't have satisfying sex. So it's like getting them to the right resources to kind of be able to communicate a little bit. And it's like, if they are holding on to shame, learn a little bit about where that comes from and maybe what they can do to sort of let that go and like shift that towards a more positive understanding. And just knowing that we live in a world that's very much still sex negative. So it's normal to have that. It's okay. A lot of us have that. But I think those that are able to experience a more satisfying sex life are those that don't accept it. They kind of work on shifting that, even though it's hard, even though it takes a while, even though it often takes like a variety of techniques to get there.
Yeah. And you mentioning that a lot of the world's still pretty sex negative. And I think that's a really interesting point as I gravitate a little bit more into the arts and media, is that while our world is still a bit sex negative, sex, love, romance, kink, fetishes are like overrepresented in the arts, especially music. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that kind of juxtaposition and that way that the media that we consume is full, like inundated with message of romance and sex.
As you were saying that, I was just hearing, let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So much.
It's wild. And I think part of it is that in songs, there is a little bit of subtlety where you're like, maybe she actually, or they're like touching their hair, they're not touching their vulva, or like, I don't know, somehow I feel like the subtlety makes it feel more culturally okay.
Mhm.
Like I was raised on so much Eminem and I didn't know what so much of it meant, but I was like, he's speaking to me. This is like so connected to who I am. And it took me years to figure out what he was even talking about. And I think the core of it is that we're just sexual beings. And a lot of us find sex, romance, love to be sort of breakups. That's like the best music, right? So I think it makes sense that those that experience that want to create it in music. And it kind of makes sense that younger people, as they're sort of learning about what sex is, might be particularly drawn to that type of music because they're kind of like, I haven't quite felt this feeling yet, but it's interesting to hear about it and someone else's experience.
Have you ever come across in your abundance of research, have you ever come across music as a fetish?
That's an interesting question. So there is something that relates to that. It's called oralism. And it's basically when you're sexually aroused by sound.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's sort of like a little bit of an umbrella term. But within that, I was looking at the definition, and within that, sound counts and music counts. So for some people, it's like they're into more audio erotica. That might be more common. But I think for some people, it's the sounds of sex itself,
Mm-hmm.
or they want to listen to other people have sex. But for
Mm-hmm.
some people, it can be music.
Yeah.
So I haven't personally met someone with this desire yet, but
Yeah.
I'm sure it's out there. That doesn't surprise me at all. And it
Oral.
also makes sense because uh sex can be like erotic in the same way music can be.
Mhm. Yep.
And research shows that when you listen to certain types of music, it can, your heart rate kind of tones to the music. So it can increase in that way. And you can kind of experience that rhythm that actually can be like a form of foreplay for some people.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and yeah, when you talk about music and just thinking about the email you sent me about things that you liked, when you had said you liked anything with horns, maybe it's the rock or chickeny, but I thought horns, not
Oh, wait.
or I was thinking like this, not a trumpet. But there is something to be said, having been in band all through high school, there is something to be said about like the breath work it takes to play
Oh,
instruments.
yeah.
It's a very physiological experience. And yeah, listening to music, you move with the beat. And so
Yeah.
there's yeah,
And
that's
I
really
feel like it might make you a better lover, at least better at certain types of oral sex for people with vulvas, I would think,
yeah.
playing a horn instrument, you know?
No, interesting. And before we wrap up here, one last question I was gonna ask, which goes back into more the taboos of certain things. You host a lot of trivia nights across the five boroughs of New York, and in your trivia rules, one of them, and I'm paraphrasing, so please tell me if I'm wrong, but you talk about, don't call anybody out in public. Yeah, like if you recognize somebody from the trivia night, don't say, hey, you're the person who knows a lot about feet or about like the
Exactly.
consistency of sperm.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, um, given, to your previous comment about living in a sex negative world, do you think something like that, like not calling somebody out or not saying, hey, I recognize you from this, does that reinforce sex shame or negativity? Or is there a
Mm,
difference between privacy and secrecy when it comes to
mm. But that is such a good question. So, what I think is, I don't want to tell anyone else what to do with their body or what they're comfortable with. So what
Mhm.
I think a way forward would be if individuals feel comfortable to sort of say whatever is true about them.
Mhm.
So I don't want anyone to ever feel called out when they're not ready to talk about what it is. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? So
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like an individual battle. And I think the world would be so much better if, as individuals, we were able to share more openly about our sexual desires, about, hey, I just went to a play party last night, or hey, my partner and I experienced this, or hey, like I didn't get it up last night, but that's normal. Just to normalize these conversations among friends and among maybe not family, but just in general, normalize these conversations. But I don't think it's necessary for us to do that for other people. I think it's an individualized thing. So I don't
Mhm.
think you should ever call someone out for anything that they tell you in confidence or anything that you know about them. I think that's their thing. But I think it would be great if, as individuals, we were the ones that were brave enough to sort of disclose about ourselves, more about our sex life. And I think that is what would sort of help normalize all these sexual experiences that we have, but don't often talk about.
And just a side note, for those who don't know, what is a play party?
So that is a sort of space where folks have sex in public.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Cool. We're going to thank Niki Davis-Fainbloom so much for joining and being the debut interview. You can find her again on Instagram at Miss Bloom Educator. She hosts, again, a bunch of different trivia nights around the city. So look her up, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was so lovely talking. I'm honored to be the first one.
Woohoo!